I'm going to be focusing on the influence that governments have on toxicology issues using examples from China and Iraq. Shenlong village in the Yunnan province in China was once a healthy community with clean water. The construction of a paper factory next to the village has put the health of all of the villagers at risk. The pollution here is so bad it turns the water of the rivers red. People living here are dying from cancer at alarming rates. The most common kinds of cancer are stomach and lung cancer, but many other types of cancer are also very common in this village. The toxins from the paper plant are entering the environment through the water, soil, air, and the livestock. Before these factories were built, cancer was not prevalent in this area. Now, new cases of cancer are constantly emerging in people of all ages. Cancer mortality rates have risen over 80% over the past 30 years and is the leading cause of death in China. More than 70% of the country's rivers and lakes are now polluted. But what is causing the cancer in all of these villages? Many studies believe that the cancer is likely linked to chromium-6. Chromium-6, which is also known as hexavalent chromium, is a heavy metal that is toxic and has many health risks associated with it. It is a carcinogenic to humans, or it's known to cause cancer, when it's ingested. Chromium-6 is not only a carcinogen, it is also a genotoxin, which means that it can damage genetic information within a cell, and then that damage of the genetic information can be passed on to future generations. So it's not only the people that are living in this village now that are at risk, it's also their children. Chronic inhalation of chromium-6 can lead to lung cancer. So obviously these people that are living in these villages right next to these factories and paper plants that are breathing this stuff every day are at a huge risk of getting lung cancer, and there's not really much they can do about it if that's where they live and that's where they're born. Chromium-6 has also been found in drinking water in the US. A study was done in 2010 of 35 cities around America. And out of these 31 cities, or out of these 35 cities, 31 of them tested positive for having chromium in their drinking water. This is a map showing chromium contamination in various US cities in parts per billion. So you can't really compare this to the amount of contamination that the people are being exposed to in China, but this is just to show us that this is also happening in the US, that we're being exposed to this carcinogen in our drinking water. So this cancer-causing pollution, like that was seen in Shinlong village, is by no means limited to this village. It's estimated that over 400 cancer villages are in China. These cancer villages are spread across every province in China, except for Qinghai and Tibet, which are to the far west. So villagers in China understand that their crops are being affected by the pollution. They know that the water is contaminated, and they know that the pollution is causing cancer because it's killing their family members, all their neighbors all the time. So because of this, they, for obvious reasons, don't want to eat their crops or drink the water. So they sell their crops sometimes. So instead of eating the polluted crops themselves, they're forced to sell it on the street to make money because some of them may be paying off hospital bills and they have no other way of getting an income, so they're forced to sell these crops. So because of this, the cancer-causing toxins that are coming from the factories are being spread to more places than just the villages that are right next to the factories. So in this picture that you can see right here, that this is a rice paddy directly next to a factory. So obviously, if the factory isn't being careful about the environmental issues, all the rice that's being grown in this paddy is going to be exposed to toxins. Another region of the world that has innocent people being exposed to toxins is Iraq. So it was discussed in the Democracy Now! Video that we watched for class that the US invasion of Iraq during the Gulf War left behind cancer and birth defects that are still occurring today. Iraq has seen massive increases in cancer cases, and many of them are attributed to the use of depleted uranium and white phosphorus during the war. Now, not only were people living in Iraq affected, but also US soldiers that were there fighting for the US, they were also impacted and are still seeing the effects of the depleted uranium. So these birth defects are absolutely shocking. I, for one, had never seen anything like this in my life. Didn't know that things that horrific were happening to children around the world because of man-made bombs that we were using for war. So these birth defects are happening at an incredibly fast rate, and the numbers that the government, or not the government, just reporters have for the number of birth defects that are occurring are most likely not even remotely close to how high the numbers probably really are, because women are most likely having their children at home, and if they're being born with the birth defects and not surviving, then those numbers are not going to be reported. So we really have no way of knowing how many children have been affected by this depleted uranium and white phosphorus from the Gulf War. So babies are being born missing limbs, and their organs are sometimes they're born with their organs outside their bodies. It's reported that there have been 14 times more birth defects in Iraq than even in Japan after the nuclear bombings happened. Although international law bans the use of chemical weapons that will have a lasting impact on civilians, the US Pentagon has admitted to using depleted uranium in Iraq in the 90s. This also goes against the Geneva Protocol, which is the protocol for the prohibition of the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and of bacteriological methods of warfare, and has been enforced since 1928. So depleted uranium, the substance that they believe that is causing the cancer and the birth defects in Iraq, is also referred to as Q-metal double alloy, or D38, and it's used because of its extremely high density by the military for defensive armor plating and armor-piercing projectiles. Uranium is a toxic metal, and exposure can affect the functioning of the kidneys, liver, brain, heart, and as seen before, can cause extreme birth defects. The US uses depleted uranium in its military weapons and ammunition, and when these weapons combust on impact, an aerosol is produced that can contaminate a wide area around the impact site and can be inhaled by the people that are living there. So to me, one of the most disturbing parts of doing all of these readings and watching these videos is that the government's neglect of their own people. In both China and Iraq, the governments were refusing to acknowledge that their people were dying because of pollution and in the aftermath of a war. Some people believe that this was happening in Iraq because the government just didn't want to scare off investors, so they didn't want to tell them that all of these terrible things were happening because they just didn't want to risk not getting money. In the village of Shinlong, where the people were being forced to live in the toxic waste of a paper factory, the people have tried to protest, but they weren't allowed to protest. China's economy has grown exponentially over the past 3 decades, but at the expense of its people. Only very recently has the Chinese government acknowledged the need for environmental protection and addressed the rising rates of cancer, even though it's been reported since 1998. Although the government has finally acknowledged the problem, people living in the small villages here still feel that the local authorities continue to treat the issue with denial and intimidation. Governments need to control the amount of toxins that the general population is exposed to, and companies need to be held responsible for the harm that they do to the environment and innocent people.